Thank you for joining us for this session on critical milestones in resource recovery 2014 and priorities for the future. We have a distinguished panel of leaders ready to talk to you, and they're reflecting their experience in government, business and research. Alex Serpo in the middle, Jenny Pickles, Mike Ritchie, Steve Beaman and Veena Sahajwalla. The panel will give us some of their insights into recent landmark events and decisions, and they're going to share their views on futures, preferred futures and inevitable futures, I guess. And I'm hoping that you, the audience, will quiz the panel and test their ideas. The session format is as usual. I'll get through these preliminaries and set the context, and then introduce each panel member briefly, and each panel member will then make a small contribution, a small statement about how they see the landmark events and the future events. Then we'll open up for questions, and at the end of the session, after questions, if we exhaust the questions, and only if, I might ask the panel to make some concluding remarks. Please save your questions until the panel have made their opening statements. There'll be plenty of opportunities, and I'm asked to ensure that all mobile phones are turned off or down. By way of introduction, just listening to the presentations this morning, I reflected on the progress made in the waste industry, waste and resource recovery industry over the last 20 years. It's been phenomenal, and the progress that's been made by both government and private sector have been made in the backdrop of a situation where demand for waste services has consistently outstripped GDP growth. ABS reports waste generation of a growth of 145% for the 15 years, 97 to 2012. 145%. So, in turn, growth for recycling services, more specifically, has outstripped waste generation growth. In just 1 year, I think it was 2009-10 to 10-11, the value of materials recovered and sold increased by 18%. 18% in 1 year. Forget about Sydney house prices, this is really something. And what we've seen is most of the big private sector players have shaped their strategies around resource recovery, resulting in significant investment that we've seen in recycling technology and infrastructure over the last 15 years particularly. And all that time, the waste policy framework has been evolving and is now very nicely integrated thanks to the work of people like Steve and Jenny who are on the panel, and their agency colleagues, of course. And the outcome is that Australia is close to the world leaders in resource recovery and sustainable waste management, in my view. So the panel will each present their views on the landmark events that have shaped resource recovery in recent times, particularly during the last couple of years, and maybe touches on some successes and failures along the way. But the panel, and I particularly want them to identify the future priorities, what they see as the future priorities and what they see as, in scenario terms, the future landmark events that are going to shape the way we manage waste over the next 5 to 10 years. I know the panel are prepared to tackle the tough questions, so don't hold back, we'll have some fun. So let me first introduce Alex. Alex Serpo is the Director of ResourceRecovery.biz, Australia's most popular portal for recycling and waste management professionals. It's just talking to Alex, it's a news portal, so have a look at it. It looks like fun. Over to you, Alex. Thank you.
If anyone ever needs to identify the journalist, it's the person running the opposite direction to everybody else, just so you know. So that's what I do. I'm going to take a slightly different tack and talk about where I think the industry needs to go, but not in a technological sense. Now, any successful professional can tell you the value of this old adage, that if you perform well today, tomorrow will take care of itself. Now, this panel is all about current and future priorities in resource recovery, but in this industry, I think future priorities are obvious. I think they're obvious to everybody, and that's that we want to move to an economy with higher material recovery, right? Plainly, everybody agrees about that. So while there may be some disagreements about the details, broadly, the future vision for resource recovery is well understood, both in Australia and globally. So the challenge is not creating a vision for the future. Instead, I believe the challenge is this. In order to get to the future we all agree upon, we need to accurately know the present. Now, Resource Recovery, my business, is an industry news service. This means my role is every day accurately knowing what's happening around the industry. And what I've learnt in this role is how little is known about the present state of this industry. For example, can anyone accurately say how much waste gets produced in Australia every year? Now, if you're in the transport industry, you could probably accurately say exactly how many roads there are in Australia, right? But in this industry, there's very poor data. Or, for example, how much waste gets recovered, or what is best practice in resource recovery, or even what waste is. Broadly, when I'm looking at this industry, I divide it into three key segments: landfill, collection, and recovery. Now, in the landfill industry, the national trend is consolidation and higher standards in landfill management and performance. In collection, the trend is digitalisation and better data in order to improve fleet efficiency and transparency. In recovery, the trend is energy recovery, either via fuel manufacture or via the generation of thermal or electrical energy. But with each of these new waves of innovation, again, the challenge is not knowing the future. Often we all agree upon the future, but knowing the present. That means making industry data, best practice and latest technology available to all players uniformly. At Resource Recovery, we work to overcome this challenge by providing industry information. However, there's still a lot of work to be done to improve transparency across the industry. So I think to get to the future we all agree upon, we need to work hard to better know the present, and then the future will take care of itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. And Jenny Pickles. Jenny is Director of Waste and Resource Recovery Programs at Sustainability Victoria. She was previously General Manager of the Food and Grocery Council's Packaging Stewardship Forum, and before that she was with Eco Recycle for Victoria, and which morphed into Sustainability Victoria. So please welcome Jenny.
Thank you, Tony. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. I've stuck to the script, Tony, so I'm doing landmark events of the past and of the future. And I'm doing it from a bit of a mixed perspective, not only from Victoria's perspective, but also some of those national sort of landmark events that have occurred. And for Victoria, it was SV 2015. The fact that waste was back on the agenda and that Sustainability Victoria had a role and a policy to actually guide its future directions on waste. It had languished as the poor cousin of sustainability for a number of years, so great back on the agenda. Great too, and most refreshing thing of all for me to actually come back to Sustainability Victoria 2 years ago was to see the role of the policymaker, the department, the role of the regulator, EPA, and the role of SV in terms of program design and delivery actually coming together, and the portfolio actively working together. This is not a mean achievement to actually have government joined up and working together. So for us in Victoria, that's been a great achievement. Another landmark event last year, we had our new statewide planning legislation passed through both through Parliament, with the support, bipartisan support of both sides of government. So we now have 7 waste and resource recovery groups across the state, including metropolitan Melbourne. 6 of those have been restructured regionally. They are working with SV in delivering on the key elements of that legislation, which is firstly the statewide waste and resource recovery implementation plan, which we've been working on for the past 2 years, whose release is imminent. And then the individual waste and resource recovery plans that will flow from that to actually plan for the future growth in Melbourne and in Victoria that will see Melbourne outstrip Sydney in terms of population by 2050. So we've got some serious planning issues to do in Victoria over the next decade. We hit the 70% recovery market last year in 2013-14 in Victoria, but unfortunately we hit the same figure the year before. So we haven't seen any change. We've stagnated a bit. At a national level, I think there's been some good achievements, some not without some teething problems, which is the establishment of Tyre Stewardship Australia, which is the new product stewardship organisation representing brand owners for tyres. Every state has got problems with tyres. I don't need to tell you about it. We've had bikie gangs involved in Victoria. We've had illegal dumping. We had a major fire. 50,000 tyres went up in Moyston, which is near the Grampians area of Victoria, in January last year. It's highlighted this issue has been neglected for far too long. We've had new regulation passed in Victoria only about 2 weeks ago that will see a requirement for sites that are managing a certain number, I think it's 5,000 tyres, actually have to be licensed facilities from now on, and we're working very closely to build the capabilities of this fledgling product stewardship organisation to deal with the ongoing issues, to look to make sure that we are using accredited collectors and sorters who are handling this material. And TVs and computers, of course, the scheme is up and running, not without its setbacks, subject to review, but at least we've got something that we didn't have before. So I think it's worthwhile reflecting that we've had some achievements along the way. And to look at the future, for Victoria, for me, the future is the last unlicensed landfill closures in Victoria. We've got 21 to go from over 130 a decade ago, and SV has been working very closely supporting local governments to both close and to establish transfer station capabilities for that waste to service communities over more than a decade. After more than a decade of work, we will have a national paint product stewardship scheme in place this financial year. Probably not until May. Things are going through. SV has been leading this project for the past couple of years. It has taken years of effort to get us here, but it's a significant landmark now that the organisation is now progressing to progress a levy on every tonne of paint that will enable its collection into the future. For me too, it's the result of that integrated planning, because what that integrated planning at both the statewide level and the local and regional level will give us is the evidence base. The evidence base to go to government to explain where infrastructure gaps exist, what Victoria needs to enable us to handle the mix of waste streams that we will be dealing into the future, the growth in population, the changing demographics, all those issues that Steve alluded to earlier in his presentation. Importantly, that will involve a real strengthening around collaborative procurements by local government in order to aggregate and consolidate materials to actually put to the market. We need to get better at aggregating and delivering clean and suitable products to a market that can utilise those materials, and collaborative procurements will help us do that. We've also got a strong role that we're looking forward to actively work in investment facilitation, helping people work their way through the maze of processes to actually get a project up and running. So SV is actively working and partnering with Invest Victoria and other arms of government to bring that to fruition. A challenge ahead, and it will be the ongoing challenge for what we call social licence to operate of our waste and resource recovery facilities. We have significant challenges in Melbourne, not just around landfills, but about resource recovery facilities, largely through inadequate planning in the past that has enabled encroachment on those facilities, that is probably upset communities because of the way those facilities have been managed. And it's a serious issue that we need to take our community through the story into the future of why waste. We've almost made it too easy for people to deal with their waste. Local governments all around the country have done a fabulous job on waste, but we have made it too easy. And unless it's in your backyard, you don't really care, so long as it's picked up and collected. That densification of Melbourne that's occurring in Sydney as well too, that will probably be exacerbated by the projected population growth around those hubs, is a real challenge. We don't have the answers, I don't believe, yet. I don't think anyone's got the answers on how best to do this. So that will be our challenge. And of course, we have a review of the EPA Victoria that's occurring. We have a piece of legislation that was landmark legislation across the world in 1970. It's still the same act. 40 years later when it was dealing with with issues that are quite dramatic issues, dramatically different issues today. So the review of the Environment Protection Act will be a core element of that. And I'd like to see us working much more collaboratively. We've already had some discussions with New South Wales about how we can harness the collective knowledge that sits within each of the states and work more collaboratively together on areas of mutual interest. So I want to see more of that too. So thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Now, Mike Ritchie is Director of MRA Consulting. Prior to launching MRA, Mike was General Manager of Business Development and Marketing with CETA and previously a General Manager of Services at WSN. He's also been State Manager for Visi and a Director of Liverpool Council. So please welcome Mike.
Thanks, Tony. Looking at the key milestones of 2014, I guess the one that I really want to point to is the fact that the understanding of this conference and the understanding of the waste industry in respect of the economics of waste is rising rapidly. For those of you who've been coming to this conference for the last 20 years, like I have, 20 years ago it was all about landfill design and landfill capping and so forth. What we're now seeing is a much more strategic focus on the economics of waste and what works and what doesn't. How do you make this industry actually work as a sector? We are by far the biggest and growing manufacturing sector in Australia. We generate $11 billion towards the economy. We employ about 35,000 people, and yet we're not on government radar. So my critical milestone is the fact that this sector has started to mature in terms of its advocacy to government. In terms of specific milestones in the last 12 months, there's a few that deserve mention, most of which, of course, have been led by the New South Wales government. And I have to say, we live in a regulated sector, and if the government is sitting on its hands, not a lot happens. And that is certainly not true of New South Wales at the moment, where we have proactive ministers and organisation led by Steve, delivering real reform that makes a difference to waste management and recycling. The first, of course, is Waste Less, Recycle More. $467 million is an unprecedented injection into infrastructure development and waste recycling, both in terms of food and green organics, composting infrastructure, recycling infrastructure, and programs for local government. The second, of course, is the economic underpinner of resource recovery in New South Wales, which is the levy, hitting $133 this year on the 1st of July, is a major stimulus for anyone who's in the recycling and resource recovery game. It creates the headroom. Queensland got rid of its levy last year, and the recycling sector has declined by 20% in Queensland in the last 3 years. The regulatory amendments introduced by the New South Wales Government, both in terms of the proximity rule, that you can't transport waste more than 150 kilometres to landfill it, and the thresholds, reducing from 12,000 tonnes to 6,000 tonnes, and restrictions on stockpile will fix some of that illegal activity out there and creates a level playing field for the decent and responsible corporate operators out there in the resource recovery and landfilling sectors. The energy from waste policy, of course, has set the scene for the emergence of energy from waste portfolio and infrastructure in New South Wales, and there's any number of applications coming through the pipeline, and I'm sure you'll hear some of that over the next few days. And finally, one at the federal level, the Emissions Reduction Fund has now created a $14 per tonne incentive for resource recoverers and landfill operators to do good things for the planet by abating their emissions. While it's cream, it's not going to underpin any projects in and of itself, but it does provide a new revenue stream for people abating carbon emissions. In terms of the priorities for the future, again, understanding the economics of this industry, all products in this industry, apart from paper and cardboard and metals, are subsidised by somebody, whether that's local council subsidising curbside recycling via a gate fee, right through to commercial operators subsidising food processing. Unless we get the economics right, then none of this happens. And therefore, my key milestones for the coming year, and a nudge to Steve, continue to raise the levy by $1 or $2 per tonne per year, and hypothecate that fully to improving the landfill stock and some of that rationalisation of illegal and unlicensed landfills in New South Wales. The introduction of weight-based charging to the commercial sector so that commercial operators start paying by weight rather than by lift. And the C&I sector is the least performing recycling sector in Australia. And that's, in my view, largely because the price signals that would otherwise be passed through are not. They're diluted by the fact that they pay by volume, not by weight. The third, of course, is going to be the continuation of Waste Less, Recycle More, with about another $100 million going into infrastructure this year. And again, congratulations to the government on this program. Most of that will go into food and green organics infrastructure, and we're already seeing 29 councils coming through, progressing the establishment and introduction of food and green composting and collection services, and congratulations to those councils who are pursuing that. One other bid I would make is for better integrated planning between the EPA and the Department of Planning, and that disconnect was recently highlighted in a Land and Environment Court decision where waste has been redefined in the planning legislation of New South Wales, but of course not in the POEO or in the regulatory section. So we now have an almost institutionalised disconnect in what waste means in New South Wales, how you plan for it and how you regulate it. MRA has just recently released a discussion article on that if anyone's interested in pursuing that, or ask me a question in a minute. And finally, I see the emergence of C&I dirty MRFs over the next couple of years, again as the levy creates the headroom for waste companies to introduce commercial industrial sorting of waste that they've currently got sitting on trucks directed to landfill. We will see the emergence of better C&I dirty MRFs in New South Wales. We only have 3 little toys at the moment, and we should see some new and bigger ones coming on stream in the next couple of years. And I think that's it, Tony. Thanks very much.
Good. Thanks, Mike. Now, Steve Beaman is, as you know, Director of Waste and Resource Recovery at New South Wales EPA. I don't think in the introduction this morning it was said that he is responsible for waste policy, reform, compliance and programs all together, which is really neat. I think Steve needs no further introduction. Please welcome Steve Beaman.
Thanks very much, Tony. An easy way out of this is to say I agree with the previous speakers. There have been a lot of achievements that have happened over the last year or so, but the highlights from ours is getting out a new waste strategy. So the 2014-2021 Waste Avoidance and Resource Recovery Strategy. There was a fair amount of work in the background to get that done. We had a legal obligation, a statutory obligation to benchmark that against world's best practice. We'd set up what we thought was an excellent expert reference group that had Tony on it, Bob Verhey, we pulled out of retirement, and Vaughan Levetsky from South Australia. And we also had 2 EPA board members on it, Julie Savett-Ward and Christine Colvington. And I think the way that we've tried to rewrite that strategy, we've sort of kept it in the same sort of trajectory of the previous waste strategy, so we didn't want to rock the boat too much, but I think the new version has much greater clarity around the targets and what our objectives are around the targets, and building a better metrics and evaluation framework that underpins that. And really that's part of one of the key cornerstones for us, is to set for both councils and industry that there is a game plan in New South Wales. You've got to know where you're heading towards, and they're the targets that we're setting for 2021, and let's see how we can get there. So getting that document out at the end of this year, the end of last year, was fantastic. The other was the Protection of the Environment Operations Waste Regulation that Mike alluded to. Regulatory reform is never easy. It's always a real task of juggling. There's a couple of competing interests around environment protection. We know when we regulate waste, we're actually regulating a market, so how do you do that environment protection without distorting the market too much? And if you are going to distort the market, then you've been very clear about why you're doing it. And then trying to future-proof a regulation, which is also very hard to do in terms of setting law, but thinking of things that are going to come up in the future. And so there are technologies that we don't have today, or they're in their infancy today, that we know are coming on board. And the things I'm talking about here is tracking technologies. So how do we track waste? And so how do you build a legal framework that gives you that flexibility to, when over the next 5 to 10 years we can roll out these new systems? As Mike said, the proximity principle was, I think, quite an innovative way to think about, and this is really around this concept of resilience. It really came to us last year around how do we, and really what Waste Less, Recycle More does in a funding perspective, is how do we give communities the infrastructure to be able to look after their own waste and just not move the problem somewhere else, be that international export, be that moving it to another region in New South Wales or interstate. So thinking about the proximity is really having that discussion around local communities being responsible for the waste they generate, and that's really apropos to Jenny's comment about we have made it easy for communities. You guys make those systems and collection services seamless, so waste isn't a problem. But as soon as the garbage trucks don't turn up, or we've got nowhere to landfill, all hell breaks loose. The next one for me, and it's been a really positive one, was actually having regional waste strategies for the first time in New South Wales all come out roughly at the same time. And so having all the regions in New South Wales having a strategy framework, having data, and then building a first generation plan about how they're going to manage their waste across New South Wales, really that was hats off to people in local government that prepared that. And I think, again, that for me, looking into local government from that perspective, was that seemed to start conversations around the regional collaboration, and I don't think it one in the waste space has to be forced, because there's clearly conversations that can happen at a regional level where people can share ideas or infrastructure or some funding opportunities, and we really started to see that come through those regional strategies. And then the last one, it's been a sort of big year, so I just want to bring it down to a few things, is the government making a decision in New South Wales around container deposits. It had been a contested space for a long time. A lot of work had gone into it, sweat and tears, to try to pick apart the answer. But the New South Wales government had made a decision at the end of the process that it wanted to proceed to go forward. And I think that was quite a monumental decision, no matter which way you look at it, really. That we've got clarity now about what government's policy direction it wants to take on this space, and so that gives us, I suppose, the permission or the instruction to go deliver. Which, looking forward to 2015, is the next phase for us will be, I'm going to go backwards now, but on the same path, is we're going to have a discussion with everyone about what a CD system would look like. So the government's now some form of container deposits by 1 July 2017. That sounds a long way away. We probably don't have enough time, so we're going to have to go like the clappers. So we'll be working pretty hard over the next couple of months to put some meat on the bone, and then there'll be a fairly extensive consultation process that will have to happen right across the waste sector and local government, but also with the community and the beverage and retail sector. So we need to, we'll need to have that discussion, and we'll need to think about, again, not trying to implement an old system, but trying to look forward to a more innovative system. For us going forward, and you've probably seen it with the Hey Tosser ads, you know, we're not going to leave the infrastructure journey behind us as such, but for us, the real movement in the space is the Changing Behaviour Together strategy. So if you haven't seen it yet, get online and have a look at it. We're really keen for people's input. We deliberately put the closing data comments to be after the COFS conference because we wanted to have this conversation. But we really think the gel that makes the infrastructure work is changing community behaviour, changing the behaviour in those communities to use the systems that we put out there to the most effective way. And you often see that in a lot of the work that's done by councils and community and attitude behaviour change. And it's how do we bring that together? We don't want to run over the top of it, but how do we bring it together so it's a coordinated approach, whether there is a single point of truth that the community can go to on resource recovery and recycling, and then how do we bring that together to have some very consistent messaging? And once we get that consistent messaging, then you can start to roll out some mass media campaigns similar to Tosser. So it allows you to move into the social media space, it allows you to do Facebook. Apparently people don't watch TVs anymore, but we need to think about how we connect with the community about using the things that we think are important going forward. So, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Now, lastly, Professor Veena Sahajwalla is Director of the Centre for Sustainable Materials Research and Technology at the University of New South Wales. She has been introduced this morning, so I'll just hand over to Veena. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I guess from my perspective, really just to be able to look towards the future and, but in doing so, acknowledge some of the reasons why the Smart Centre has been so successful in developing a lot of these new technologies that I referred to in the morning. So whether it's about producing, you know, the kinds of green steel solutions that we've talked about, or producing particle boards made out of agricultural waste. And there is a long list, and I won't dwell on that, but I guess the point there is that the partnership and the genuine collaboration between different groups coming together is important, acknowledging industry partners, but also you know, noticing the fact that there has been federal government funding. The Australian Research Council, the ARC, has supported a lot of this basic scientific research that has gone into processing waste in a completely different way. So that's been important. The reason why, of course, that funding and support has come in for science is because these types of scientific solutions clearly don't exist in textbooks. They are not out there for us to just go and cherry pick. They actually need to be developed. And that's an important part of the messaging. So moving forward, and of course, the Australian Research Council grants allow us to do the science, but the nice thing for all of us here is that you know, off the back of a lot of that scientific research, for us to be able to implement solutions is the important next step. So yes, we've done some of the work leading up to tires. For instance, I mentioned earlier this morning around 2 million tires being utilized now by One Steel, and those are numbers, of course, coming out of what we've done in Australia, but also then moving forward and saying what else is out there in the space of the kinds of difficult materials we've heard everyone talk about, whether they come from electronic products, which of course then contain different types of plastics and glass, and then of course I'm sure everyone's got a whole range of different types of products that traditionally are considered non-recyclable. So for us moving forward, it is about bringing together once again a collection of what I call, you know, team members and collaborators. So it's people like you who are in the room who are basically having to deal with what these challenges may well be in the future, or indeed things that are on your plate right now. Pulling in, of course, a lot of the smart young people. So I do want to now spend a little bit of time as we are looking towards the futures. What is the role of developing human capital? Should we be looking at young students who are interested in science and technology, but are often told that, well, there's no future for science in this country? And I think, again, that's such a negative message to take forward to young people, because all they hear about is, oh, research funding has been cut, and therefore science is really not a career to pursue. And I'd, again, counter that by saying there are smart people interested in science and technology, and this industry can play a very important role in coming to the forefront and being a part of the process of education and training and getting exciting opportunities for young people to participate in R&D programs, participate in training and internships. And there are a whole lot of different ways in which this industry can actually play a role. Believe it or not, young people are hungry and looking for opportunities to do training. I mean, we get a whole bunch of people who are studying science and technology very keen to participate, get that hands-on practical experience, whether it means working with councils and understanding what sort of waste is collected in a certain region, because they happen to be from that region, is a great thing. So kids go back home during the summer holidays. It would be fantastic for us to be able to tee up summer vacation opportunities and experiences for young people so they can indeed go and see what role they can play. And I think bringing together minds of the future who are going to be developing innovative solutions into the future is so important. I think our role as a university is to be able to be the place and the focus where young people come in to study science, technology, engineering. So you've probably heard of discipline areas coupled together is referred to as STEM. So that's science, technology, engineering, and maths. And again, there's a role to play. STEM comes in, whether it's science, engineering, and even students interested in maths. We hear about logistics and tracking waste, for instance. So opportunities for IT, computing, chemistry, physics, engineering, a whole range of different disciplines that brings young people together into this sort of space, I think is going to be very important for the future. So I would really wish that there are councils and regional groups and industries that are keen to support young people as they develop through their process and their journeys of education, so that education is not just seen as what they go out into the university and sit in classrooms and study, but also gaining hands-on practical experience, whether it's through internships and other programs like that that we have at University of New South Wales, and no doubt other places have those offerings too. But I think in a proactive manner, to be able to put your hand up and make that available to students is going to be an important role that we can play. Again, we cannot do it alone. We have to have partnerships with industry and local communities to enable that to happen, so that we continue to develop these types of innovative solutions. The kinds of programs that we run really wouldn't be possible if it weren't for the fact that there are smart people from Australia and all over the world, and minds coming together to develop these types of collaborative solutions which stem out of the university. So yes, R&D is an important place where the journey begins in most of these cases when solutions are not that obvious. But the fact that they've got to be implemented on the ground means we've all got to come together to make it happen. So moving forward into the future, we're excited about the fact that the ARC has also supported a green manufacturing hub at UNSW, and this green manufacturing hub is meant to do exactly this. Yes, it's about R&D, but it very much is about engagement at all levels, and to be able to implement our ideas and bring different people together in this space, along with young people in this journey moving forward. So for us, an exciting future. We are about to kick it off this year, so I guess look out for what we do, and we look forward to having a bright future in this space. So thank you.
Thanks, Veena, and thank you, panel, for those crisp presentations. It's now time for questions, so over to you guys. There's roving microphones available, and I'd ask you just to please identify yourself and wait for the microphone to come. Any questions? Yes, over there. Angus?
Okay, I'll be brave and do the first question. Angus Johnston from KMH Environmental. Mike, one of the trends you suggested would be coming our way would be the rise of C&I MRFs, dry waste, I presume, dry waste mixed dry waste treatment. As you know, we've been working on the infrastructure needs analysis for New South Wales, and one of the dilemmas I see with that trend coming to fruition is the incentive that the large waste companies have, particularly in Sydney, to continue to go to existing large bits of landfill infrastructure and all the trucks and associated transfer stations that'll make that to happen. And there are some sort of second tier, for want of a better word, waste companies that are driving towards C&I MRFs, your little toys as you refer to them, because they haven't got much choice if they're going to compete, given that they have to pay more to dispose of mixed waste. How will that current barrier be broken? And for the whole panel, starting with Mike, how can we break that situation?
This on? Thanks for that, Dorothy Dixon. Angus, that's appreciate. The levy is by far the key driver of the emergence of C&I dirty MRFs. The numbers right now are very break even, so you're absolutely right. I think in the absence of the levy continuing to rise, and I think for those of you who are in recycling in this state, take the opportunity to nudge Steve and write to the Minister that the levy should continue to rise, albeit not at $10 a tonne, but at some smaller rate. Because, as you say, Angus, the net present value calculations are very break-even on C&I dirty MRFs at the moment. There are a couple of companies that have lodged some applications recently for some large ones, so they've obviously crunched the numbers. I think the rise of landfill costs will continue anyway. Landfill costs have been rising at about 5 to 8% on average for the last couple of decades due to improved enforcement and management requirements by EPAs across the country. So I think that will underpin it, but I would certainly encourage anyone who wants to bring those forward sooner to continue to nudge government towards increasing the levy further. And I also expect that there will be some diversion of organics, and if that diversion of, including pallets, paper, cardboard, fibre, food, if some of that is taken out, then those companies will also get a direct action credit under the ERF. So there are some funding streams that are available now that weren't available previously, but in all of this, you never bank this stuff on the commodity sales, you bank it on the gate fee, and the direct competitor for the gate fee is the landfill. So the landfill price drives this equation. So really the key drivers are increasing the levy and regulatory enforcement around landfill standards.
Thanks, Mike. Do
And
any
while
of the
you're
other
at it, have a chat
panelists...
to the Victorian government as well too about its landfill levies.
Sorry, can you say that again, Jenny?
Sorry, I was just going to say, while you're at it, have a chat to the Victorian government about its landfill levies, which are more than half. Well, not even less than half. More than half? Yeah. So we find it extremely difficult to get. We have a couple of C&I MRFs that are actually up and operating. They're very small scale. And we had some remarkable failures many years ago with the Bax-Viz venture, which some would say was undermined, shall we say. But anyway, that was a bit of a...
We'll just ask if any of the other panel members want to comment on this issue. C&I MRFing? No. Okay.
I was trying not to. Is that working? I think you're right. I think that's why we wanted to do this infrastructure needs analysis. It's actually more than just an infrastructure needs analysis. It's actually the data, the state of play. I think it was the comment that Alex made is we need to understand what we've got at the present time. and start that conversation. So when the report's released, it isn't about that's the final piece of work. Thanks to that, we now know we need X amount of boxes. It's around what are some of the drivers around some of these parts of the sectors. Are there some market failures in that? And there's some more work to do around that. And I think, really we've adopted that whole integrated approach around education, enforcement and infrastructure. So it's not just around the infrastructure. And, we're having a stab at trying to go out to 20,000 small, medium businesses, which is, a mammoth task to do. 8,000 have been done to date. And from that data set, we're going to understand the motivators of people at the waste generation end from a whole range of small businesses. And there'll be clues in there for us about how we educate, how we provide different offerings. I always describe, I think, my perspective of a waste generator is me taking my car to the motor mechanic. I suspect when waste companies are dealing with these small generators is they're not really sure. I don't think they don't know what the right questions to ask. And so they just get the offering that the waste companies provide. And if we can forearm people with some better information and better knowledge about their sectors, then they're going to be able to ask their operators and make them sing for their supper. And I think there's probably that can do some heavy lifting for us. And I think the back end of C&I in particular is its reliance on commodities. We know people have got very cheap exports that they can get out of the country. They just whack it in a container and, more power to them. But that's going to be going to be a relatively short-term solution. So do we need to start thinking about adding on to the next part of the value chain? Because we talk about the productive economy, maybe we're talking about not working our way all the way through to remanufacture, but maybe it might be making the next component, and that's where Veena's work comes into play.
Okay. Further questions? Yes, Rebecca?
Just on the subject of C&I recycling. On the subject of C&I recycling, Jack this morning from San Francisco was talking about mandating recycling in businesses, and I was just wondering, I know it's probably a long way off, but if you guys are considering at all.
We are very soft touch regulation in Victoria, and I think that's been traditionally our way. I don't think there's any indications of any interest in mandating commercial and industrial recycling, just as there has never been any interest in mandating municipal recycling. Tell if there is interest in going that path. I still don't think we've really addressed the source separation stuff well enough. The charging by weight issue, of course, which is an issue that some sectors of industry are looking into as to a way that you could drive that behaviour change you want to see in the sector. Programs like the Harvest program, we've waxed wane, in supporting those sorts of programs over the years. It's how we can actually continue to build on what we've got and do a bit more without, I think, the hard fist of regulation. But Steve may have a different perspective.
Let's hear Steve.
The regulator in me wants to ban things and mandate things because it's a simple way to do it. But I think if you do that, you lose often the nuances, particularly not recognising the fact that each part of the waste streams are all in different parts of life cycles and maturity. So I think you can only really start, putting bans into the mix when you actually have a number of viable alternatives that are actually in a mature, relatively steady state or about to be steady state. For example, and I think e-waste is a good example in that, it's great we have a product stewardship scheme, but that just then overheats really quickly, and then you get this excessive stockpiling. You get people that are, they have a service, then they lose a service, and you just get that sort of instability in the system, and that's what can happen when you introduce a ban. So you've got to tread very carefully, and then you're always going to end up with things with bans about it doesn't play out city versus, coastal versus regional New South Wales, or city versus country. The economics is always slightly different, and the drivers are slightly different. So how do you enforce those bans? How do you do it with equity and universal of access to service and all those issues? So it's not something we shouldn't take off the table, but I think there are probably a whole range of other more nuanced mechanisms that might get us along the same pathway.
Okay, any other panel members want to comment on that one?
I would just say this, you can control quantity or you can control price, but you can't do both at the same time. A regulation controls the quantity that's going to landfill, but it leaves the market to decide the price. And you can get some incredible distortions, as Steve said, with people unable to process it or whatever. A far more nuanced and sensitive way is to deal with price and affect price, and that will create the market opportunities for businesses to come and do things rather than the ham-fisted regulatory approach, which is a black and white binary decision. It's either going to landfill or it isn't, no matter where it is. Whereas if you're more sensitive about applying price, you get more nuances. Hence, my advocacy for continuing to increase the levy, but particularly hypothecating levy to rural communities and rural councils and rural infrastructure, so that you do overcome some of those rural-urban conundrums.
Yep. It seems that we in New South Wales have chosen the market mechanism, and that's fair enough. But one of the problems, of course, is that when you MRF, C&I dry waste, there's 40% residue that has to go to landfill, and that creates a dilemma for the regulator or the policy setter. Very interesting. Okay, other questions? Yep. John? Down here. Connie, thanks.
Thanks, Connie. Just the one.
How many questions?
Just the one.
Name first, John.
John Kavanagh from a Port Castrap Regional Council, about 3.5 hours south of here by road, called Great Lakes Council. Just without trying to play the devil's advocate a little bit here, don't you think there's a place for some regulation in the waste industry at the moment, particularly with problem waste that we've been struggling with on and off for years? And I think some of the EU countries have picked it up. Jack highlighted it this morning. Let's just get rid of polystyrene and let's get rid of plastic bags. Just some simple things like that we don't need. I know we probably don't have the political will, especially at the national level, but just to throw it out there for you guys to have a little discussion about.
So plastic bags, so it isn't off the agenda. So Environment Ministers have asked New South Wales to work on, to bring back to them by the end of the year, some national approaches to plastic bags, single-use plastic bags. So that's something we're working on as we speak. So I think for that one, say watch this space. I agree with you. I think we need to start re-engaging and having our various level of governments re-engage with the Commonwealth Government about the activation of some sensible product stewardship programs. There's some in the pipeline, and Victoria's been taking the lead on paints. We've got tyres up and running, we've got TV, so we've started, but we need to, I think, collectively put the pressure on and make sure that the things that we think can be managed well by product stewardship, we keep the pressure on that it keeps happening.
Polystyrene? John mentioned polystyrene as well.
I've never thought about polystyrene. Yeah, look, it's. I think there's, and I think that's part of the struggle. And we do this at the APC. Is a lot of this stuff comes imported. Like we've got to recognise the fact we're beholden to a global economy now, and a lot of this stuff arrives on a shipping container, whether we like it or not. And we're a very small part of a global market. So for Australia to say we don't want styrene around our TV sets, we're 3 hours or 7 hours worth of production on a Sony TV production line. Like that's the reality, and it's very difficult to get our arms around it. That's just the reality of the problem. I'm not saying we should duck it, but it's just hard.
Jenny, plastic bags?
Probably not high on the agenda in Victoria. Certainly we've got an e-waste ban that our government, as part of its election commitment, that we've just commencing work on in that particular area. So we've been off looking at what's going on in South Australia with their e-waste ban, and we'll tread very carefully in that direction and consult very broadly and widely with local government and the community about the implementation of that ban. I suppose for us, our hit list has been getting paint. We've invested so much damn time. It costs us $1 million a year through our household chemicals collection program to go around the state and pick the stuff up. We want paint done and dusted so that we can free up that funding to do other good things with. Batteries are also on the hit list too. Queensland has the lead. They're problematic materials in landfill. You know, it's nasty stuff that we're putting into the landfill, potentially, or down our waterways if that be paint. So let's really deal with those ones. We've also got compact fluorescent lamps on our hit list too, after that, about addressing those. And then after that, there's probably a list that continues to go on. For me, I'd rather address the more harmful products and the more risky products that are going out, and in the interest of protecting the environment, they're the high-risk items for it. They're also on the list nationally at the ministers' levels, as well as issues to address. Polystyrene, I think there's some interesting work starting to emerge in that area. There's been a bit done for Victoria, but it all hinges on the ability to compact and get the stuff down and to the end market in a way you can actually do something with it. So it's not without its challenges.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And Veena, just before we leave plastic bags, is there any scope for us to really create a plastic bag material that would not harm the environment, that would degrade quickly?
I think it does come down to, you know, with all of these materials, the economics of how you're going to, even if you look at an alternative solution, there may be an alternative that is environmentally the right thing to have because it does degrade and so on and so forth. But I think it comes down to, one, the economics around it, but two, also the long-term sustainability. I mean, if you're using, let's say, the simplest of the things that we do, which is to pick up the bags for weekend shopping, for instance, you want to be able to have something that's strong enough, that's going to last a long, long time, rather than yet again creating another solution that's going to last you another month and end up in landfill again. So to me, it's also a question of when people are producing alternative strategies, it's looking at fundamentally at the property of that product and that material. And if it's not going to last the distance, so to speak, then you probably shouldn't be getting into it in the first place. And so I'd probably look at that as, you know, the important question on day one, and not proceed with the product just because it looks like it's a good alternative on day one, but, you know, on day 30 it falls apart. So I guess there are those interesting challenges that we've got to start to look at in any product performance that we do from very beginning. It's about evaluating its properties for the long haul, which means is it truly you know, a good product to have as the alternative.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Yes, Alex.
One thing I'll note as a reporter, if Australia was to ban single-use plastic bags today nationally, we wouldn't actually be a leader, we'd be a follower, because these bans are very common internationally. As many of you probably know, across Asia, all of China, Italy, Ireland, a number of US states, including California, I think, which will implement a ban soon. So this stuff isn't radical, it's actually quite common.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Just over there.
Thanks. John Wheat, Resource Recovery Australia. Alex, you noted that there's some waste to energy projects coming down the road now that we've largely settled the regulatory framework, as I understand it. I remember being here at least 10 years ago and listening to our guest from the US, whose name and provenance escapes me at the moment, I'm sorry. But the observation that he made was, look, you guys, you're doing some great diversion stuff here, and aren't you lucky that you've got a country with so much room and lovely stable soils you can put landfills in, so that you don't have to get into that burning caper that they do elsewhere, and you know you can have nicely run landfills so that your great grandchildren can go and mine them sometime in the future when they feel up to it. Have we got that balance right? Was he wrong?
Who wants to have a go at that?
Can you just clarify this question? Are you asking if we've got the balance right between resource recovery and landfill? Is that your question?
No, the question is, we have waste for energy projects coming up.
Yeah.
that will mean that those resources are not buried somewhere for a future generation to use perhaps more profitably than we might be about to use them today.
So you're asking about the role of waste to energy in the overall waste ecosystem, is that right?
Versus landfill?
Versus landfill.
Yes, versus landfill.
Okay, I'll get a bit philosophical here. My view of waste reduction and resource recovery broadly is that we have a model for a zero waste system, right? Because natural systems don't produce any waste, right? And if you think about natural systems, there are two material flows. There are structural materials which go into biomass, and there are energy materials which get consumed for metabolism. And if you follow that model, you can see that there's a role for both energy recovery and material recovery in a zero waste system. And I think it's important and that we should pursue it.
I'll have a go and see if I get closer, because I see you trying to... Look, remining landfills is probably a long way off, and you have to overcome the asbestos contamination issue if you're going to start remining landfills. So I think that's in the distant future. I think the New South Wales government has got the balance probably pretty right around the energy from waste policy, because it sets quite strict hurdles that you've got to get past and preserve the recycling system as it currently exists. And there's basically 50% limits on what you can burn. So you can't just take waste and burn it in New South Wales. There's different levels of hurdles for the domestic sector, the commercial sector and the construction demolition sector to ensure that those sectors continue to grow their recycling and not just take a least cost or a energy from waste option. That is not true of some other states in Australia, which are probably going to expose themselves to some cannibalisation of the recycling systems. But I think New South Wales has understandably set some very high hurdle rates for the introduction of energy from waste so that it doesn't cannibalise existing recycling systems, but also ensures highest and best use going forward for the material streams. And most people would acknowledge the highest and best use for plastic is reusing it as plastic, but if it can't be transformed economically back into a reusable plastic, and the choice is simply landfill it or burn it in some way, gasify it, pyrolyse it or incinerate it for energy, then energy is a more preferable use. Given that binary decision between landfill or energy recovery, that energy recovery is a better option. So as long as you're restricting that binary decision to stuff that is legitimately residual of residual and all the good stuff has been taken for its highest and best use, then you've pretty much pursued the New South Wales policy settings.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
Thanks for that reassurance.
Now, we need to move on. There's a question here, and then we go over there, I think, and there. Okay. Running out of time, so panel, we have to keep the answers very crisp.
Hello everyone, my name's James Turnell, I'm at Armidale Generic Council. Had a little bit to do with organics, and something that really gets my goat is the complex products. I've just seen, for example, the pyramidal tea bag. We said to our residents, you know, let's put your tea bags in the organics bin, simple. Now there's new products come out, and so then there's confusion in the community. Our compost is pretty clean, but what really irritates me are the little plastic tags that are on every bit of fruit. I think if we're going to get real with organics and we're going to get real with good quality source separation, then we need to make it easy for residents to be able to dispose of their organics. So I was just wondering whether or not we could somehow mandate or ban the use of plastics with our sort of pre-prepared foods and stuff, which make it complicated for our residents.
Steve, I think that's for you.
For the easy questions. I agree with you, and I think we should collectively, there's a pressure here, we shouldn't be victims of this, and I say this to people in the general public, about we can influence what the retail sector does, and we need to influence people's attitude and behaviours to it as consumers and put that pressure back on the retailer system. Have we spoken to the retailers and said the labels, the stickers on the apples are a pain in the backside and getting off, you know, it affects the downstream composting? And I suspect we haven't. So, you know, we need to gather those issues that annoy us or makes the recovery of particular organics difficult and go and have that conversation. And I think we'll find the retail sector will be quite responsive.
Good. Okay, thank you. We'll move on. We'll have that question over there. sorry, okay,
Oh,
very
sorry,
quickly.
Tony, I was just going to make the point that you could extend that analogy out to a whole range of other, shall we call it, not necessary for life products, you know, the things that we just get shoved on our faces. So I think perhaps another message is, you know, let's not collect those. Certain sort of places that serve food also provide certain things for kids to play with for 1 minute. And I'm not mentioning names, but I guess the point is that it's up to us as consumers to sort of go, right, I'm not having that, which kind of makes the same point that message goes out, and the most powerful people are us as consumers to be able to not purchase those products, I suppose. Yeah.
Yep. Alex, very briefly.
I might just jump in and I say, I think biodegradable plastics also have a middle role to play in that market as well to help out.
Yep. Okay, now that question there, and then we have one more over there somewhere. Yep.
Yes, Jeff Pryor is my name, and I represent 13 local councils from the east of New South Wales. Just on the plastic bags, people will be aware that the ACT government has been running banning the plastic bags for a while with some interesting results, and we've just sponsored a small country town with the collaboration of the Chamber of Commerce and exploring that. But my question really is a bit more about the future. I've been very interested in people's perspective about that, but it's interesting, here we are in Coffs Harbour, presumably halfway between Brisbane and Sydney, where we've seen that population increases will be significant. But we face the problem in non-metropolitan, Australia, of if we get very good diversion rates, the materials then have to flow back to the main centres. From our perspective, there's really not much economic return unless we find an alternative. So I'd like to ask the panel, what ways could we actually be supported in our rural areas to foster the businesses, the science and technology applications, so that the businesses may not necessarily be large, but fit for purpose and fit for size? I'd like to know what sort of strategies there could be to help us do that.
Good point.
I'm just going to jump in and say, if industry can find a way to truck landfilled waste from Sydney to Queensland, then surely it can find a way to truck recoverable resources from regional New South Wales back to the city.
So I'll give you a practical example. I mean, the kinds of conversations that we're about to have at this conference over lunch and so on. An example of something that I'm quite keen to follow through is exactly something like this, where you can work with small groups, whether they're NGOs, councils and governments, but at a local level to be able to create some niche products. So whether these might be products for the built environment, whatever they might be, but to be able to produce it locally is an important part of the solution. So it doesn't have to be something that you've got to ship to some big manufacturer somewhere out in Sydney, Brisbane and so on, but it could be niche products that you are able to make, which of course have a local flavour. An example of something we've published, we've used things like macadamia shells and eucalyptus capsules and so on to be able to make sustainable particle boards, completely eliminating the need to be able to use traditional materials in there. So there are solutions that you can develop at the local level, and then the next is the leadership that those local groups have to take in picking up these solutions and implementing them at the local level. So yeah, no, it does certainly need leadership. I don't think it's just about the fact that you've got to always ship it out to the large city centres. You can do it at a local level.
Just quickly, Mike.
Jeff, it always surprises me that we as a nation have pursued yellow top recycling bins. Average household generates 17% of it by weight is yellow top bin. 66% of what an average household generates is organic waste. Now, we ship all that yellow top material to Sydney and Melbourne, as you say, but we can compost that 66% of organics locally. So of your 13 member councils, how many have a food and green organics bin, composting locally, creating local jobs, using it in the organic space in the farming community locally? Well, probably none. There's 29 out of 155 councils in New South Wales that are approaching food and green organics. There's only about 6 that do it right now out of 155. That's the obvious next step for councils who are faced with that commodity transport issue, is look seriously at food and green organics locally. And generally, it's more expensive than landfill, as is curbside recycling more expensive than landfill, but councils bought into curbside recycling because they wanted to do the right thing. My argument would be buy into food and green organics now, do it locally, create local jobs.
Thank you.
I would just add, but do it collaboratively too, because that can give you the opportunity to get the economies of scale, the right type of technology at the right cost and employment opportunities. So look for those opportunities to aggregate the tonnes to put to the market, because you'll be in the best chance of success if you can aggregate it, provide the stock, industry will respond and you'll get the investment.
Now, we're very close to lunchtime. Last question over here, I think. In fact, we're beyond lunch. Try it again.
Now, can you hear me?
Yep.
Kerry Dalton, Bundaberg Regional Council in Queensland. I'm just wondering if we'll ever get to a point where we have a more unified approach to waste management, with the federal government sort of, I guess, enforcing more. It's very piecemeal, and we know that some states do it a lot better than others. We in Queensland are the poor cousins. With CFI, I guess it gave us a bit of a push to achieve a few things up there. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you see that happening in the future, if the federal government is going to take more of an approach within waste management and give, I guess, us guys a bit more of an opportunity.
Let Steve have a go at that. He sits on the, or attends the Ministerial Council meeting, so let's see what he thinks of the feds.
I think your aspiration for that national involvement doesn't play out structurally because of the Constitution. Like there isn't a constitutional role for the Commonwealth in waste. So that's where the Commonwealth often lends its weight to its delivery of things of national interest, defence, education, social security. That's because they have a direct role, and so their role, and it's an aspiration of all the Australian environment ministers, is maybe every book doesn't have to have the same cover. We all don't have to be the same, and there are some very stark regional differences between APY lands in South Australia to Bundaberg to Western Sydney. Like that's a reality. We're living in very different contexts. But there is a very strong push, and it's a word used a lot, and it's only what I can think of on the spot, is harmonisation. It's not having things that are silly, so having either policy or regulatory frameworks that they don't have to be the same, but they should be consistent and consistent in terms of its application, its monitoring, evaluation, its reporting of data. And I think that's where you're going to get the push, particularly from environment ministers, is around this consistency.
But I would also say that there is quite a lot of collaboration between environment agencies in the states and between the New South Wales people and Queensland and between Victoria and Queensland as well.
I'll also make a note as a reporter, there is actually a national review of environmental legislation happening right now. I don't know if anybody knows about this, and the current government has a strong appetite for deregulation, so it now might be a good time to talk to the Department of the Environment if you have these kinds of concerns.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, we've gone over time, and thank you, audience, for your participation. Thank you, panel, for your great words.